Female athletes launch a lawsuit against trans competitors. I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. Time put out an article today that really highlighted for me just how out of touch some parts of the developed world is becoming. So they write that the families of 3 female high school runners sue to stop transgender athletes from competing against them. Now, if you want to break that down further, where it makes a little bit more sense, it basically means that biological women are trying to stop biological men who identify as women from competing against them in sports. Fundamentally, the women feel that it's unfair for this to happen and it ruins their chances at competing. And by women, I mean the biological women who are launching the lawsuit to get the federal government to reconsider their stance on the issue, to get them to block trans athletes from participating in women's sports divisions. Now, of course, this has become super controversial, but we need to put the logical hat on for a second here to really think about it. This really isn't that much of an unreasonable claim. First of all, I believe people have the right to identify as they wish. Have at it, do you. Even if we disagree ideologically, you should still have that freedom. The reality is, though, that these actions here, they cross into aspects of other people's lives on occasion, and we need to understand how to handle that. Whether that is creating laws to force people to conform to the ideology, or having girls competing against people who have gone through a male-type body growth. We have to understand that identity isn't just a singular issue. It plays into the lives of other people, and we have to know how that's going to translate. Now, I don't know why I have to clarify this in 2020. There are certain differences between how a male body changes and how a female one does. One is not better than the other, they are just different. They have their own strengths and gifts. Putting a biological male in a women's sports division is of course going to be advantageous to the biological male regardless of how they identify. Simply changing your identity isn't going to change the physical traits of your bodily functions. And even on top of this, nobody wants to talk about it, but there isn't a predetermined criteria for becoming trans. Right now, all it is simply a declaration. You cannot disprove that. You can't even prove it really. If I were to say that right now I identify as a woman, you have no recourse there. This is how the game is being set up. Logic isn't bounding anything. It's a simple truth that biology is real. That is why we have gender-specific divisions in sports in the first place, to create a more competitive, fair environment. Nobody in their right mind would be celebrating if, let's say, Conor McGregor entered the women's MMA division, or if LeBron James changed his mind and entered the WNBA. But we change our level of standard, though, when the biological male in question applies a personal identification to the equation. When they say they identify as a woman, does that make everything okay now? Does that make everything fair still? The answer clearly is no. There are biological differences at play here in people like McGregor and LeBron James, and them changing would not be appropriate. Them entering the women's division would give them an advantage just by dint of their biology. I'm always stunned when I encounter the odd person who's going to try and make the argument that biology isn't a relevant factor here. There is no difference between males and females, and that everything is subjective. That's just the biggest disconnect with reality that I've seen in recent memory. In literally no other domain would you be celebrated for denying science, but in this case, it seems to fly under the radar. Now, I can understand why the women launching this lawsuit are feeling let down. The fact is that it's a complicated matter, and hating on trans people isn't the solution. The people competing want a practical method to get back to a fair playing field. Now, I'd rather nobody feel needlessly bad about their personal situation, but we need to find the logical path forward here. Biology does matter. Feelings matter as well to some extent, but all we've done here is create further inequality that undermines women trying to compete in sports. Trans women should be allowed to play sports like everybody else, but it makes more sense to me to have them enter a men's division if anything, using biology as the basis for your competitive realm and not personal identification. That is the reasonable choice, but it's contrary to the ideology though, because the trans woman would say, we are just women. Why would we enter a men's division? That's how the argument would go. There really isn't any winning that. I also had this conversation with somebody else, and a pretty funny dialogue ensued. So their idea of a solution would be, well, let's just create a trans department then, or a trans field, where there'd be male sports, female sports, and then trans sports. And immediately I was like, oh, could that work? And then 1 second later, I realized no, it wouldn't, because the trans people don't see themselves as that. They would want to be in the women's sport because they identify as a woman. Having a trans barrier is also contrary to what they're trying to go for. They're trying to establish that they are women. So no, having a third division I doubt would be successful. And then you have to consider the monetary appropriateness of that, if it can actually be profitable, and a whole lot of other things are going against the notion. So now we get back to the article, and it published the names of the women who launched this case, and I feel that may be problematic. They're all high school students, and knowing how polarized the populace is now, I hope people act responsibly given that information. By not trying to dox them or intimidate them, they are just high school students, and because they think differently than you, that's not reason to go after them. And one lady from this group who launched the lawsuit put forward this quote: "Mentally and physically, we know the outcome before the race even starts. The biological unfairness does not go away because of what someone believes about gender identity. All girls deserve the chance to compete on a level playing field." That seems quite reasonable to me. Then a lawyer chimes in by saying that forcing girls to be spectators in their own sport is completely at odds with Title IX, a federal law designed to create equal opportunities for women in education and athletics. And Connecticut's policy, she's talking about them allowing trans and non-trans women to compete in the same division, violates that law and reverses nearly 50 years of advances for women. I don't know if it violates 50 years of advancement and progress, but lawyers have to be a tad bit dramatic. It's in their job description. It does compromise any sense of fair competition, though, and that's obviously observable. Now, here's where things get more interesting. The school board responds back by saying that their policy follows a state anti-discrimination law that says students must be treated in school by the gender with which they identify. So the state enacted laws that weren't well thought out. Now we're witnessing the consequences, and this lawsuit may not even be fruitful. The school board really is following the law right here. They're being ordered to do this, and you might say, oh, it contradicts this law over here about gender equality, but they're just going to say they're following what they're being told to do, to accept someone's gender identity as whatever they proclaim it to be. These schools' hands are effectively tied unless these lawsuits start tackling whatever the previous law is. And it's all good until we encounter the real world here and the nuance really starts to seep in. Then we realize, oh, maybe these laws aren't actually as productive as we thought they would be. And if we cut to the chase, there are 2 points here. 2 paths forward from this station. One where biological men, also known as trans women, are able to play women's sports, or one where we put in some rules to ensure equity for biological women. I know the reasonable answer is pretty obvious, but reason isn't the dominant mode of navigation when it comes to these issues, though. It's one extreme or the other. Here's some more context about the case to express why these women feel they needed to take legal action. So there are 2 trans sprinters in the division, and the article also named them, and the same thing goes here. I hope people don't go out of their way to harass some high school students. So these trans sprinters outperform their cisgender competitors on a regular basis. They've won 15 girls' state indoor or outdoor championship races since 2017. They are dominant. The 3 girls who launched the lawsuit compete with them directly, and they just feel it's fundamentally unjust. They're constantly being beat, and it seems obvious that biology is playing a factor here. And one of the trans athletes gave their take on the issue. They don't feel there's an unfair advantage at all. A direct quote is that one high jumper could be taller and have longer legs than another, but the other has perfect form and does better. One sprinter could have parents who spend so much money on training, which in turn will cause the child to run faster. Now, I understand where they are coming from. They don't want their accomplishments to be belittled. They're not going to go up there and say, yeah, biology gave me an advantage against my competition. But the rationale does not hold under scrutiny. They're just a high school kid, though, keep in mind, so there isn't a need for excess hostility. They're trying to make the case, that lots of factors can impact performance, which is true, but what we're looking at here, though, is if we control for the variables, what happens? The girls who compete against the trans athletes all train, I'm sure. I'm sure they're putting in work and practicing nonstop. Yet, they're dominated by a large margin. Form can only get you so far when biology gives you limits and ceilings that you have to play within. I'm sure the accomplishments of these people are impressive in their own regard, but in the domain of women's sports, having the physical biology of a man does in fact give you an edge. There is literature to support this. It's a fact-based argument. I'm not too sure why it's in doubt right now. Telling the biological women that these things don't matter and training or form can make them winners is just not the whole truth here. Now look, it's a certainty that some people being trans is going to be a reality of life going forward. Some people are going to identify differently, even given our ideological qualms. Luckily, we live in a free nation where you can do that. You can do one thing, we can disagree, but we can both live in peace and harmony. What we have to do, though, is iron out what happens when this ideology impacts other people. Not just when it's about you. When it's about you, do whatever you want. But when society comes into question, that's where a debate has to be had. You should feel free to act in the way that you see fit, but when laws come into play, forcing people to think the same, forcing them to use these pronouns, or forcing us to pretend that identity trumps biology in sports, it will cause a rift in our society. We need to talk about it and find ways to coexist peacefully. This cannot be done with unreasonable premises. It cannot be done by infringing on the rights of other people. It cannot be done with radical campaigns either. Something like fighting for trans women to be competing against biological women is a losing battle. We clearly see the aftermath of it, and it's not fair. Then there's other notions too, like regulating people's choice of words by law. Controversial. That's a losing battle as well because it conflicts with freedom of speech. Then there's other ones that are coming up too now, such as campaigns around trying to make it discriminatory if a cisgender person doesn't want to date a trans person. So now you want to force a love relationship upon people. You want to hold them in contempt if they're not willing to do that. These are all bad ideas. The common thread here is freedom. We want the freedom of being able to navigate these new realities the way that we see fit, and I think that you deserve the freedom to do that in your own regard as well. To have the freedom to identify as how you want, we should be able to have our own ideas on the matter, and where we converge is where these things intersect, such as sports. Unfortunately for all of us though, there seems to be a weird level of tension with these issues. We can't even debate about it or speak freely. There is a prevalent narrative that's being jammed down your throat, and if you don't accept it wholeheartedly, you run the risk of being called a bigot or a hater, when the reality could be that you're just trying to find a middle ground. You're trying to find a path to success for all parties here, and not just one. If you really think that things are going so swell right now and we are already on this path to success, I suggest that you look at reality. Look at all the conflict and the issues that are coming up from this topic. There is 100% a middle ground here, but the far left is pushing for complete indoctrination, while those on the opposite side want complete erasure. They want to get rid of the trans ideology completely, and the people who have it, they don't care about them. That's a bad thing. There is sympathy to be had both ways here. To understand the struggle of these people, to sympathize with them, but to also understand the aftermath of the decisions. To see the biological women who can no longer compete. To understand that's an issue too. To understand that biology is real. To understand that you may not want to buy into it and you may want to identify as you see fit. These things can all be true. You don't have to pick sides with these. What we do have to do though is get our priorities straight. Infringing on the rights and autonomy of others is no way forward here. It's not going to bring us to where we want to be. Now, just to bring it back to the case for a second, I do think that the biological women have a strong point to make. That women's sports are seemingly becoming insignificant due to these trends now. There are biological men entering the field and they are dominating. They are winning everything. One must actually ask, what is the point of a women's sport in that context now? And at the same time, the case is very complicated because of the laws that exist within that state already. There is regulation that forces the school board to buy into the students' vision of identity. So you can launch a lawsuit against the school board saying that what they're doing is infringing on another law, but they're actually following the law. There are two conflicting ideas going on here, and it just points to me the fallacies and inaccuracies of the system. The people in charge of legislating these ideas have no idea what they're doing. They have no accurate pulse on what the public's perception is, and at the same time, there is not understanding how to traverse these terrains here. In part, that is due to a breakdown of freedom of speech. By not being able to debate the ideas, by not being able to work out the flaws, how do you think good ideas are achieved? By cracking down on a singular idea and chiseling it to make it stronger. I'm going to be honest, these notions are coming off more as dogmas, where they are held as inherently true, and any opposition, any questioning of it is seen as a sin. That's a recipe for a disaster, not a productive law, not a productive policy. If we cannot talk freely about it, all you're going to get is it in its current base form, and we can see in that form there are many issues with it, issues that we have seen coming a long time ago, but we've been unable to tackle them. We haven't been able to prepare for them, because as soon as you say something, you are demonized. That is not democracy. That is authoritarianism. This is the issue with taking away freedom of speech. We're cracking down on it. All you're left with is bad ideas, because here's the reality of life. People have two avenues for addressing conflict. It's either discussion, dialogue, debate, or it's violence. And I'm not saying that violence is the right answer. It's actually the worst possible position for us. That's why we have to hold conversation in such high regard. That is the best way to handle the situation. Any attack on that front to diminish our ability to speak, it should not be tolerated, because it forces people into a box. That action comes as a detriment to all of society, and it's one of my biggest pet peeves with this issue, and many more that are occurring in contemporary times. People are not willing to discuss, we're not willing to debate anymore. It's our idea or the highway, and it's a disaster waiting to happen. So, that now brings us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and share. That will help us grow. And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Perry Platform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.